And welcome. Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a new book called The 12-Step Buddhist. He's going to talk with us about that today, about how you can merge Buddhism with the 12-Step program to try to find yourself hopefully free from addiction. And I'd like to welcome our guest here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Darrell Littlejohn. And Darren, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. My pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Now, this title here for me is pretty interesting. It reminds me of about 8 years ago when I had talked with an author of a book called One God Clapping. And I got to tell you, I got very curious about what this book was all about here. Let's talk about how you came to create the 12-Step Buddhist.
Well, the story is that I got into recovery from drug and alcohol abuse when I was about 22 years old. And that was the first time in my life that I'd ever really had any relief from that chronic suffering that all drug addicts know about. And it was a fantastic adventure for about 10 years, but I wound up in what we call in Zen Buddhism, in an existential crisis, so to speak, where the experience of practicing meditation and 12-step recovery separately became unbearable. So I had to return to the previous lifestyle. And when I came back, because that obviously doesn't work anymore after you go, there's a saying they say in AA, a head full of AA and a belly full of beer don't mix. So it doesn't work no matter how hard you try. So I had to come back to recovery in 1997, and when I did that, I had to find something different because I thought I'd exhausted all the possibilities. Mm-hmm. I thought I'd turned over every rock and tried every program and type of therapy and spiritual practice. So I really got involved in Zen again and in psychotherapy and using that as a spiritual practice. And I tried to have a new approach to the 12 steps, something different than I had tried in the past. And that eventually led me to meet Tibetan Buddhism, which really revolutionized my outlook.
Oh, yeah. Anybody who's ever met a Tibetan Buddhist will realize those guys just seem to be inherently happy all the time.
Well, the Dalai Lama is our supreme example of that.
Mm-hmm.
If you can stay happy in the midst of that type of turmoil and a 50-year enduring crisis and keep a smile on your face and do well, they're onto something.
Exactly.
So that's how I came about getting into the different types of things that I wound up writing about in the book. But it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I started blogging that I really began to kind of synthesize those ideas into a cohesive format that other people could respond to. And I got a lot of positive response on my blog. Mm-hmm. And that encouraged me to start some workshops. And the workshops encouraged me to start some meditation groups, and from there I just started writing. Mm-hmm. Eventually that came to be the book.
Very good. Now, Darren, and the 12-step program, which if I believe so, was created by Bill W., who was a recovering alcoholic. That's true, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay. Because I had remembered that I had attended some AA meetings and, as a result of a driving under the influence charge. And what I was interested in discovering is that as I would go to these meetings, I noticed, okay, you're replacing your alcohol with the drugs, or both, but you're chain smoking and drinking a lot of coffee. And I'm thinking, okay, so what's the relevance of this? It was like, taking one addiction and saying, well, we're going to move that out, but we'll go ahead and do these other things. And the other thing for me is that I felt like once you were an alcoholic or addict, that's what you always were. And I thought, well, if you become clean and sober and try to move toward a more productive life, shouldn't that fall away? More to say that you're apt to become that rather than being that. And it seems that in your book I kind of found that same kind of confusion with what you were writing about.
Was there a section specifically that you were referring to?
It was just something you said about how in the 12-step program they kind of keep you dependent on the group and the meetings, and that you're kind of almost feeling of being labeled permanently as that. So therefore, you have a stigma that I can't be normal again, so to speak.
Well, I think I addressed that, but maybe in a little bit different way. Going back to the first part of your question, there was a speaker back in the mid-'80s, Bob E., and he used to go around the country and talk about just what you said, that, if we're going to really be clean and sober and be healthy, how is it that, we still carry on these secondary addictions? And we just replace one compulsive behavior with another. And the typical 12-step group answer to that might be something like, well, at least we're not drinking, or,
right.
We're one thing at a time. And it does make a certain amount of sense. If you go into a treatment center, they're not going to force you to quit smoking cigarettes the same day as you give up heroin.
Mm-hmm.
It's too much. People can't handle that. I mean, in my initial term of recovery, I quit smoking after 5 years. Mm-hmm. And this time back through again, it took me another year. And, now I've been off cigarettes for 10 years. But the point is that you kind of have to choose your battle, and what's the toughest demon to wrestle first. Mind-altering substances, for example. We might get clean and sober from that and then move forward. That said, we know this now. This is 2009. When the 12-step programs were created in the 30s, and as they flourished, throughout the last century, I think it was a little bit kind of under the radar. People weren't really addressing these things. But, a lot of people through the 70s, people growing up with parents who were yoga teachers and people who had been through different spiritual journeys, and we became a little bit more conscious, I think. Mm-hmm. And people became a little bit more health aware. And I think nowadays when you go into a typical, like say for example, you go into a typical young people's group, young people's 12-step group, there's a lot of pretty healthy, pretty active people who are really experienced and have different types of experiences than, say, the crusty old drunk who crawled out from under the bridge in 1952.
And that's funny that you should say that, because typically you would picture that type of a person to be an addict, alcoholic. And in fact, they're a lot more high-functioning in many ways than people are led to believe. They always have that sort of sterno-bum scenario labeled on these people, but it's really not like that at all, for the most part.
Well, it can be. It gets there. I mean, that's late stage. Mm-hmm. And Terry Gorski calls it late stage alcoholism. Mm-hmm. But there's a lady on Twitter who, I don't have her name handy, but she just wrote a book called The High Functioning Alcoholic. And I kind of laughed when I saw the title, and I thought, well, I'm a low bottom addict. I don't really relate. But there are degrees, and so that gives you. So there's a couple of topics there, but there are degrees of addiction. There are degrees in the stages of addiction, and I think there are also types and classes of addict. And some people, there are some people, say for example, in the 12-step rooms, after more than 20 years, I've met thousands. This seems to be a typical pattern. There's always the guy who can't get sober no matter how many times he tries. Mm-hmm. I have a friend like that who's suffering right now. Great guy, wonderful guy. Came and picked me up and took me to a meeting when we had a snowstorm here in Portland. We're snowed in for a couple of weeks, and this guy trudged over and took us to a meeting. Wonderful person, but he wants the heroin and the crack.
Right.
And the booze, and he can't get himself. So why is he different than me or the other guy who is able to get it? And that's a mystery right now. I don't know if anybody really has the answer. Buddhism might have an answer if you talk about karma, and I talk about that in my book in detail, the explanation of karma and how that's different from the explanation of things like, this is what God wants for me, for example. Mm-hmm. A little bit different approach. Mm-hmm. But the stigma, and once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. In Narcotics Anonymous, they say once an addict, always an addict.
Right.
And people from the outside of the recovery movement say, hey, hold on a second, that's negative. Once you're clean and sober, you're clean and sober. Well, the reality is that I have a condition in my DNA called addiction. It's a brain disease. I write about this in my book. I've done extensive research on it. There's a lot of new evidence and new studies out about just exactly what type of impairment addiction has on the brain, before, during, and after. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that once I have that condition, like say I'm allergic to strawberries, I'm never able to safely have a strawberry, even if I haven't had one for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So that's why we still say in meetings, well, I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic. It's not because we're trying to keep ourselves down. It's because we're trying to really stay tuned to the reality of the condition that if I am to put something in my body again, nothing has changed since the day I got sober. My body will still react like an addict. Mm-hmm. And I proved that to myself. That's why I'm such an adamant proponent of 12-step, is that I proved that after 10 years, I was actually just as much of a fiend for the drugs and alcohol and women and everything else as I was, that actually I was worse. I was worse over time. We have a saying in the 12-step world that while you're getting sober, your disease is out in the parking lot doing push-ups. So that's why we say it. That's why we try to reaffirm it. Now, do people in the 12-step world make the mistake of kind of keeping themselves down? Yes. Do people in the 12-step world feel a little bit like getting sober is all they can manage and they can't really grow beyond that? Absolutely. Do they replace one addiction with another? Without question. That's why I wrote the 12-step Buddhist, because you can go further. You can deepen and enhance your spiritual recovery, stay sober, and actually attain that kind of perfect happiness that people like the Dalai Lama, you may be the only one, but like the Dalai Lama, just like we were talking about earlier. There's a lot more that can be done than just simply getting sober and white-knuckling it, as we say.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you decided to, I guess, merge Buddhist practice into the 12-step program, how did you see how they kind of could work well together?
Well, the thing is, it's pretty obvious at first glance if you look at the 12 steps and you look at some of the basic things of Buddhism. It's kind of obvious in some respects. You know, in Buddhism we talk about attachment, and in 12 steps we talk about addiction, and so on. But in terms of interweaving those into a daily way of life, it really took a lot of work and a lot of pain and struggle for me. Mm-hmm. And I had to go through a lot of counseling about it and discussion groups and so forth with my various spiritual teachers. And I think the pivotal turning point for me to understand how to integrate these two came about when I understood that it's not all or nothing. It's not one or the other. Mm-hmm. I am an addict, and I'm a Buddhist. When I became a full-fledged Buddhist, so to speak, a few years back when I actually took a Buddhist refuge, I'd always been a Buddhist practitioner, since the mid-'80s, but I'd asked my teacher once, should I take the precepts? And she had a very Zen answer about that, and she basically said, why? Is that going to make you a different person? Mm-hmm. It's easy to say, oh, here, I'm a Buddhist, but how are you going to live? So when I went through a more formal process with a Tibetan Buddhist nun about that, I kind of got a little bit more into it. And I realized in the retreats that I was on in Buddhism, having the discussions in the discussion groups, going to the Zen hall, I realized that I'm like sticking out like a sore thumb here as an addict. Mm-hmm. The addict has a certain personality and a kind of a flamboyance and kind of an arrogance and certain ego, and we're kind of usually pretty sharp people, yet a little twisted. So it was pretty obvious that I was the addict in the Zen group, but I wasn't going to leave the Zen group. And when I went to my 12-step groups, it was very obvious that I was looking into a deeper spirituality than the average person who's really just trying to stay sober just for today.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
I really do. That's the thing is, as you were talking about earlier, it seems to have a precept of an all or nothing. It's this or that, instead of taking it deeper into the middle and kind of bringing them together in relationship, so to speak.
Yeah, the Buddhism is about the middle way, and so there's another common thing that people do in 12-step recovery. I have a perfect example of my friend Deb, and she got into the program with me in the 80s, and I just got with her on Facebook. I'm meeting everybody in the world that I've ever known on Facebook in the past few weeks. Sort of
it's amazing how we can connect anymore, huh?
It really is. And
that might be troubling for some addicts because they just like to be alone.
Well, people go through changes, and it's interesting watching. This gal, she came in through the 12-step program, but now she's really into the church, and she's really into her family and so forth, and she seems very happy and so on. That can work for some people, but for the most part, what I see a lot of people do, the mistake that they make is to say, well, say AA, for example, was a great place to start, but it's a spiritual kindergarten, and I'm going to go ahead and get more into my church right now, and I don't really need to go to the meetings anymore. And what you miss when you do that is this magic of one addict or one drunk talking to another. Mm-hmm. There's the inability of the other person. I talk about this in my book, where there's a look that you get from your mom, say, for example, or your spouse. When you just come off a bender and you've spent the rent, or whatever other catastrophe, when they pick you up from jail for the umpteenth time, or when you relapse and go out from your treatment center, your 37th treatment center, there's a certain look that you get, and there's a certain loneliness that you feel, that that person who's not an addict does not understand you. They do not understand why it is that you would do such a stupid thing over and over countless times. So when you go into the rooms, in the 12-step rooms, when you walk in the room and you say, yeah, I just, I did this and I did that, and it was the most horrible thing, and we look and we go, have a seat, have some coffee. Me too, I did this. Yeah, we know how you feel. And you can't replace that in the church or in the psychiatrist's office. Do you see what I mean? There's nobody else in the world who understands.
Saying, it sounds like, it's a position from people who don't understand that you're in a group where you feel like you're outside the group versus being in the group.
That's absolutely right. And so what you get in the 12-step world is a bunch of people who have the same condition and are on the same page about recovery. You can't replace that with anything else. There is absolutely no way that your doctor, who is not an addict, is going to look at you and say, oh, I get it. He's going to say, oh, no, Bob, you got to stop drinking. Your liver's bleeding.
Right.
And you're not going to be able to stop. So when I look at what I need to do for my recovery, I need to look at all the different components and all the different aspects of the condition of addiction. I need to be around those other people who are like me, but then I also need to take it deeper, because there's also another phenomenon that happens that my sponsor calls the phenomenon of the funnel, mm-hmm. which I talk about in the book. It's basically that you see a lot of people who come in and get sober, and they get 30, 60, 90 days, 6 months, 9 months, a year, and you see greater gaps between the numbers. There might be 50 people with 30 days, and one guy with 6 months, and then another guy with a year, and some gal with 2 years, and then it jumps to 5. And by the time you get between 11 to 15 and 20 and above, you might have one person representing each of those areas. Mm-hmm. And there might not be anybody over 20. And so what happened to all those hopeful newcomers who came in? What happens to people who get sober? Why don't they stay? Mm-hmm. And what can we do to help them stay? And I was one of those who didn't stay, and I came back, and now I'm in my 12th year, for the second time getting over a decade sober. Mm-hmm. What can I do to stay? And I don't want to make that mistake, whatever mistakes those are. I don't want to repeat those. So this is kind of where I'm coming from with the integration, is that I want to make sure to help the people who get stagnated, bored, switch addictions, or basically settle for less than what can really happen in a true 12-step experience.
So now, as you have implemented Buddhism into the 12-step program, have you found yourself going beyond, I guess, that decision gate that, as you say, the most of the newcomers just don't seem to be able to get to?
Say more about that question.
Well, basically, it seems like there's a threshold, a certain level that you say the excited newcomers who are, they're very excited about being sober and being productive, but it seems like there's a certain point they get to, and then they just don't know what to do next. And in you merging Buddhism, you sort of found a way to push through that threshold to find that more, if you will.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I am as excited, if not more excited, today. I'm going to a young people's group tonight. It's all a bunch of people who are, in their teens and 20s. And I'm in my second half of, I'm almost 50. So the idea, I'm 46, and I am more excited to go to that meeting tonight. This is the highlight of my week, to go to one of these meetings. I'm so enthusiastic about it, and I feel alive when I go. And why is that? Because I see the potential of the program, I see the potential of Buddhism, and I know that I can affect other people in a positive way. It doesn't mean I'm going to walk in the room and preach about Buddhism. That's not even the point. Mm-hmm. I can just go in there, and I show these exercises in my book, how you can go through the steps from a Buddhist perspective, and you can actually practice Buddhism in an AA meeting, for example. And you can also practice the principles of AA in your Buddhist meditation group. And there are certain ways of doing that. For example, just walking in the room and focusing on being present in your body and being aware of yourself and being aware of the other person. Walking up to a person in the room, for example, who is alone, and going up to them and putting out your hand, and when you take their hand to shake it, you look them in the eye, and you drink them in, and you take a breath, and you say, how are you today? And when they answer you, you listen. You don't just go, how are you, and then keep walking. So there are certain types of, and those are rooted in some deep, principles that are in 12 steps as well as in Buddhism. But so how do I get past the threshold? There's a lot of techniques, but yes, I've definitely gotten past that threshold of stagnation. I mean, something happens when you come into 12-step programs and you see people who have, 8, 12, 15 years of sobriety, and they're making $10,000 a month or more or something like that, and they have a certain type of lifestyle, and you're looking at them and thinking, that's what sobriety is going to look like for me. Especially when you get these famous speakers that go around the world and around the country speaking about what I call the circuit speaker fairy tale, which is kind of like this rags to riches kind of story.
And everybody's got a story worse than the others, don't they?
Well, the extreme is, I was a bum on the streets and puking in the gutter, and today I'm looking down on that very same gutter from my penthouse suite.
Right.
And that makes you think that the 12 steps are going to do that for you too. Mm-hmm. And that makes you think that your sobriety should look like the next guy. And sometimes what happens, more often than not, is that we wind up sober for, we're usually around 5 to 7 years, and we get into a funk, a depression. We start to question the meaning of any of it. Start to think, boy, this is really just a grind. Mm-hmm. I didn't get sober for this. I used to be able to take a drink or go gambling or whatever. And why am I feeling like this? I'm depressed. And I've done everything that my sponsor said to do, and I've worked my program, but why is it that I still feel suicidal? There are a certain portion of people who blow their brains out in sobriety without taking a drink. So the depression is acute. There's a lot of problems that occur if we really don't treat the root cause of the problem, and Buddhism treats the root cause of the problem. Mm-hmm. So I stay sober within the 12-step context, and I keep my commitment and my community going there, and then I practice my Buddhism, which really is about ending all suffering for everyone, ever. The Buddha talked about ending all suffering for all suffering beings, which is a pretty big goal.
Yeah, as they say, one cannot become enlightened until all sentient beings of the world have become enlightened, and that's a big task, and that's what the essence of reincarnation, I understand, is based on, is to keep coming back until that happens.
Keep coming back. I've been signing books lately, and I'm saying keep coming back. And if you go to an AA meeting, they're going to say, keep coming back. They might say it sarcastically if you're talking kooky that day. They might say, keep coming back, you'll get better, But I'm saying keep coming back, and I'm hoping that when people read the book and they get to the end, that they realize that that's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. We keep coming back until everybody's okay. Mm-hmm. It's a very, in Christianity, that's a very Christ-like principle that people lean that way. In Buddhism, it really is what we talk about, that enlightened compassion. And, in the 12 steps, we talk about having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. We practice the principles in all our affairs and try to carry the message to the next one, And what does that mean? Does that mean I just didn't have a drink today and I'm on my third marriage and my finances are in ruin, but hey, I'm still sober, so I'm doing good? Or does that mean I can really go deeper and walk around like the Dalai Lama, smiling and blessing everybody?
Well, it's quite fascinating, too, when you think of addiction and the person who actually has the addiction is that they begin to slowly isolate themselves, so it becomes about them. And in the 12-step program, and I know that in Buddhism, the idea is that you transform yourself to be a servant of the world with your special gifts. You can see how bringing these two things together, if worked appropriately, would actually, over time, liberate someone. And it isn't about being the guy that makes $30,000 a month from the gutter to riches, but it's about what is your unique talent, what is your special ability that you were given that you're supposed to share with the world in servitude. And you can see how that can make a solid recovery over a long period of time because of the addictive joy it feels to just do that.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I really try to emphasize with people is that, you can follow a prescribed program that has to be, done exactly the same way every time. Or you can kind of go with your own intuition. You can develop an intuition and a creativity. So if you look at all these self-help books that we've had over the past, 20, 30 years, all these ideas about creating your own life and taking control, and like The Secret book that my publisher also puts out, and that kind of thing, well, it's really about that. It's really about kind of coming up with your way and using your unique talents, even though it's within the context. There's a line from the book by Anne Rice, I think it's called The Violin or The Red Violin, where they talk about the prodigy student goes to the violin master, and they're doing this piece over and over and over, a very short 8-bar piece, and how the student felt constrained by doing it the same way every time, but how the master taught him that within that framework, there was an infinite amount of creativity, that one could add their own embellishments and accentuate the music and the rhythm and the melody and give it their own style. And that's really the kind of thing I'm talking about. You have a framework in Buddhism, you have a framework in the 12 steps, but you can really explore your infinite possibilities within that framework.
Mm-hmm.
And there is really no limitation when you approach it that way.
Yeah, I believe I was reading, and I think the right term for this is a truss. It's what a vine grows on, is that here you have, just as you're talking about, this rigid way, but how the vine grows in that is infinite. Very interesting analogy there.
That's a beautiful example, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Do you mind if I use that? That's a good one.
No, actually, I found it. It was out of a book of Buddhism. It seemed somewhere a book of Zen, and I remember that as I read that and I really thought about it, I thought that's amazing, and it was just interesting how the world began to look even from that moment differently. That all of us come into this world. Sure, let's say we've got the 10 Commandments, the same set of rules, but it's how we grow and live and do within that context that becomes infinitely interesting, because everybody does it their own way, but within that context. And it was quite fascinating, actually.
Yeah, as opposed to being the typical addict when you walk in and you say, hey, I don't want no rules, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah, they're not very good about schedules either.
Not very good about schedules. And we have another thing in the 12-step world. It's like, I was looking down at everybody from the gutter.
Mm-hmm.
We still have our arrogance and our pride, regardless of how bad it looks around us. So I think that it makes a little bit of sense to get into the structure and to use the structure, but then to start to give yourself a little bit of space within that structure and a little bit of breathing room. Mm-hmm. You can be one of those super conservative types, or you can be a kind of a wild and crazy guy, type, and still have a really positive impact on a lot of people's lives. Mm-hmm. And that's basically, in the 12-step world, you have a lot of opportunity to meet people that need some help. Mm-hmm. And these are just the ones that show up to meetings. Most of them don't show up to meetings.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to take a Buddhist perspective, really learning from Christians, learning from Catholic charities and so forth, of how you really get out there and get into the communities. And there are a lot of, Thich Nhat Hanh's a famous Buddhist teacher, and there are a lot of Western Buddhists now who are talking about that engaged Buddhism, where you're really getting out there and being involved in the community, doing hospice work with AIDS patients, and caring for people who are older and ill and so forth. And I think that there's plenty of opportunity to do that. And if you just went to, say, 2 or 3 12-step meetings a week and 1 meditation group a week, you would be practicing a very deep level of engaged, interactive Buddhism, spirituality, community involvement.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go to Mongolia and build a school.
Exactly. I remember that in the movie The Razor's Edge, starring Bill Murray, is that he went in search of enlightenment, and so as he goes to India, actually, and then he's engaged with an Indian there, and he says, a lot of people come here looking for enlightenment, but they don't realize that it's always right there at their fingertips. It's engaged in the work you do. It's engaged in play, relationships. It's all right there in front of you. And he was like, oh, I didn't know it was that simple. I could have saved me a lot of money on the trip.
Yeah, if you want to really understand that movie, read the book by Somerset Maugham. It's a beautiful book, and it's on my shelf next to spiritual literature, even though it's a novel.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of ways to go, and I think in the typical mindset of the non-addict, they think that the 12-step community there is that stigma that they have, that idea of what, well, you guys need to go there because you need that help, and that has nothing to do with me. But it really does have something to do with you if you're not an addict, because one addict, and I use the term addict inclusively to cover all spectrums of addiction,
sure,
including alcoholism.
Mm. I always find it funny how you'd hear people say alcohol and drugs, and they're both the same thing. They're an addiction. So.
Well, I mean, that's because in the AA community, they don't want you to say drugs. They want to keep kind of a pure single-mindedness of purpose, and that makes sense in that tradition, but I wasn't a part of that committee that made that decision. If I were today, I might have a different voice. But, the idea is that, with addiction, you have an effect on, countless people. And we are all affected by addiction of one form or the other, whether it's a family member, a coworker, a neighbor. My neighbor might be suffering because her husband, I'll give you an example. I have a friend in Buddhism whose husband is a chronic alcoholic. He died recently, and she came to my workshop even though she's not an addict, and she wanted to try to learn how to understand, him better and so forth. So we all can look more deeply at the problem and take a little bit more responsibility, even if we don't think that it's directly impacting our lives. It's definitely impacting our budget as a national economy, and the amount of money that it costs to, healthcare costs, all these things. And I have a whole chapter on research and data in my book, which just kind of outlines the real scope and impact of the problem. So it affects you whether or not you're aware of it.
The book is The 12-Step Buddhist, and our guest today, Darren Littlejohn. It's been a pleasure to have you on the program here. Do you have a website people can find out more information?
I sure do. The website is the12stepbuddhist.com. That's THE, the number 12, STEP, Buddhist, BUDDHIST.com. And the book's available on there. It's actually on Amazon right now. They're selling it 2 weeks early. They've shipped all the pre-orders. Yeah, and I've got podcasts that I do a couple times a month where I do interviews. I interviewed a neurologist about sex addiction, and I do guided meditations and blog articles and stuff. So there's a lot of resources on the website, and feel free to go in there and ask questions. I've got a comment section where you can go in if you have some questions, if you need some help, resources in your area. Feel free to contact me, and I'll do what I can.
It's kind of interesting how we find our own way to fulfilling the world of others through servitude, and sometimes you just don't know what that path is, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah, and as long as it's interesting, I'm not bored, and then I've got a reason to keep coming back.
Well, very good. Well, Darren Littlejohn, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Again, folks, go out and visit the website. It's the 12stepbuddhist.com and find out more about this book and any information that you may be able to have. And as Darren said, just because you're not the addict or the user doesn't mean that you're not somehow directly affected by this particular problem. So be sure that you find out more about this as well, because it's also how you can serve someone in your community as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Again, thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio show, and remember, live your day past halfway.